to our webinar today on United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 at 20 years. We're hearing perspectives from feminist peace activists. I am Maria Butler, the Director of Global Programs at WILPF, based here in Geneva, and I'll be moderating our webinar. Before we get to the agenda, I want to share some reminders that we will be live streaming the webinar today and also having a recording. There will be interpretation from English to Spanish, and I will pass over to our interpreter, Ron, to share some instructions for those listening in Spanish.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Ron, and I'm here with my co-interpreter, Mojde, and we're with Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. Buenos días o buenas tardes, yo soy Ron y estoy aquí con mi co-intérprete Mojde y estamos con la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Tilde. If you are not bilingual, you will need to join one of the language channels in Zoom with interpretation. If you have not done that before, make sure to follow the instructions on the screen, and the slide you see right now is for joining with your computer. So if you're joining with your computer, you will see a button that says interpretation, and then you'll be able to select either English or Spanish. And again, that's only if you are not bilingual. Si es la primera vez para usted usar Zoom con interpretación, siga por favor las instrucciones que están en la pantalla. Va a hacer clic en el botón que dice interpretación y ahí va a poder escoger inglés o español para poder escuchar la interpretación a ese idioma. Puede ver el visual en la pantalla si se está conectando por su computadora. If you join by phone, it's a very similar process. You just click on the More button, which is on the bottom right. There's 3 dots at the bottom of your screen on your phone, and then you'll be able to select language interpretation, and from there select the channel. Si usted se está conectando por su teléfono con Zoom, es bastante similar el proceso, solamente que va a escoger la opción abajo en su teléfono que tiene 3 puntitos o donde dice More, y ahí puede seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y escoger el idioma para poder escuchar. So just a couple reminders for people to please speak not too fast, so that everybody is able to follow what you're saying, and also for the interpreters to be able to do a good job relaying what you're communicating. Un recordatorio de que por favor no hablen demasiado rápido para que todos puedan entender lo que están comunicando y también para que los intérpretes puedan seguir el hilo de lo que está presentando. That's about it. These multilingual spaces are created with the support of everyone. So if you have any issues, please don't hesitate to communicate to one of the hosts or co-hosts to try to resolve your issues. Eso es todo. Solo un recordatorio que estos espacios multilingües se crean con el apoyo de todas las participantes. Entonces, si tiene cualquier problema, por favor, comuníquese con los anfitriones de esta reunión para que tratar de resolver su problema. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing the instructions of the interpretation. I'm really happy that WILPF is hosting this space today. We will also be tweeting, and please encourage you all to share your own opinions and use feminist peace as the hashtag. You can also use the question and answer function in the Zoom panel to ask questions, to pose comments that will come to the panel. In addition, we create today a safe space, and if you need to contact WILPF or Peace Women during the webinar, you can email peacewomen@wilpf.org. As many of you know, WILPF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, works around the world, addressing the root causes of violence with a feminist lens, and we mobilize for non-violent approaches to security and justice. WILPF operates in over 50 countries with our members and sections, and today we're delighted to have the members and partners join us for this discussion. This event is part of a series of conversations we've been having in WILPF over the last several months, and on the screen you can see previous events that are available on WILPF's website and YouTube channel. A recent one we had on feminist peace, looking at the structural causes of violence. So today's agenda is going to start with a welcome and a short celebration. Then we'll have presentation of recent research from our consultations around the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And then we will move to our panel discussion with the activists from WILPF. And we'll have time for questions and answers from those participating. So without further ado, I'm going to move us to a little bit of a celebration. Not only is today marking the anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, but also we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of our very own Peace Women program. And there would be no celebration without cake. So today, virtually, I want us to share this delicious cake of smashing patriarchy, one bite at a time, together, a giant cake of deliciousness. And to do that, we want you all to think of one woman peace activist in your own life who you would like to share that cake with, to sit down and have a coffee across borders, across time. Who would that be? Have a little reflection. Now I want you to think of that person and think of one of their strengths. What strength resonates with you from that activist, from that woman leader? And we're going to ask you to share that. So you have to go to, on your computer, if possible, log into menti.com and you use the code 7868261 and you write that one word. What is the strength that resonates with you from that amazing woman in your life? So we're going to take a few minutes to think and to share, and we'll see what we collectively come up. Okay, panelists and friends joining the webinar, have you navigated menti.com and used the code? Okay, Genevieve is sharing on our screen what words we're hearing today. Resilience is the biggest. The word you see biggest means many of you put them in. Resilience is for sure loud and clear among the women in our lives. Courage, inclusiveness, but also joy, failure. Someone put this idea that we're able to fail as women leaders and face failures. Women from the global south. And we have some great individual women's names to honor their own commitments. Warmness, protector, caring, peace. Failure is getting bigger because I think we all recognize in the work we do as peace activists, we fail, we have vulnerabilities, we need to lean on others. And from the global south is getting bigger. The women in our networks, in our lives, who are living in conflict situations, who are working conflict situations, are the strength that resonates in this piece. Oh, so beautiful. Okay, keep adding. And we will share this with you all afterwards. And really from the global south is so large and centered, I think, in our view today. And I hope we can keep that throughout the conversation around the 20th anniversary. How do we center, not only visually in this, but in our work, in every single thing we do? How do we center women from the global south with resilience and determination and inclusiveness? Beautiful. Thank you for celebrating with us and having virtual cake. And one day we're all going to be meeting in the corridors of coffee shops and being able to sit and celebrate together. So without further ado, I have the pleasure now to introduce the lead author of our upcoming report on 1325 at 20 years, Perspective from Feminist Peace Activists. Sanam Kaptan is the project consultant at WILPF in the Women, Peace and Security program, and she holds a PhD in anthropology from the Rutgers University. And she has also worked in the Peace Women program as a fellow. Sanam, please share with us what you've learned in this consultation over the last few months. What have you heard from women peace activists, and what are the recommendations from this report?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for joining us here today for this exciting event. I'd like to start talking a little bit about the background of the report, how we came to be conducting this project. And it essentially came from out of a place of concern. And this wasn't just a concern for what we know is the gap between rhetoric and reality in terms of WPS implementation, but also a concern where we're finding ourselves with this really growing discrepancy between what the original owners and partners of this agenda and Resolution 1325 feminist peace activists envisioned versus what the agenda has become now within the very confined, restricted traditional security structures of the UN Security Council. This was coupled with the fact that we've all seen an increased pushback at a global scale towards women's rights, towards women human rights defenders. And we've seen this increase with the COVID-19 pandemic, which really shown us, it made actually further visible the structural inequalities that we knew were there. So we wanted to take a step back, and instead of celebrating this anniversary, we thought this should actually be a time to critically appraise how far have we come from actually realizing what Resolution 1325 brought into our lives. So what we did was, as the guiding question of this research project, we were asking, despite the fact that we have now 10 WPS resolutions, we have normative frameworks that are telling us how we can advance gender equality, like CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action. We have had countless commitments by member states over the past 20 years, but we still live in a world with war and violence and instability, and women continue to be disproportionately affected. So we wanted to understand why is this happening? And our objective in trying to answer this question was really turning back, as I said, to the original owners and partners of this agenda, feminist activists, civil society members, peace builders. And we wanted to, in their words and in their experiences, assess what WPS implementation looked like on the ground once removed from the resolutions and the Security Council, and why there wasn't progress still despite the passing of 20 years. And we really wanted to amplify their voices instead of more words and more rhetoric. So we had to be a little bit creative in terms of how we did this, because we couldn't travel due to COVID, and we ended up conducting everything virtually. We selected 12 WILPF sections, as well as our civil society partners that we spoke with across 12 countries, both from the global north and the global south. We had a group call with our Young WILPF network to understand what it is that they saw as part of Resolution 1325 and how it's being implemented. And we solicited input through a survey. And the biggest of these consultations was this online global event where we had over 180 WPS practitioners, peace builders, activists coming together and discussing what it is that was working for them and not so much in terms of implementation. So what did we find? I will briefly go over this. We found that there were three primary biggest obstacles to implementing what was advocated through Resolution 1325. These are all cross-cutting in the sense that the lack of implementation on one impacts the other, very similar to the WPS pillars. In terms of the first one, militarism and militarization, the most familiar here probably for us would be the fact that the agenda is being interpreted in an increasingly militarized way by adding women into security structures and kind of diversity within security structures as accomplishing women, peace, and security commitments. But what's been interesting here for me is that what we know already, there's a almost complete lack of discussion about military spending and disarmament and how this is one of the biggest obstacles. And the fact that the WPS framework is seen as something that only conflict-affected countries need, even in post-conflict situations, ironically. For the second challenge, this issue of undermining of the WPS agenda here, you can probably guess that this is about human rights, the lack of human rights in the implementation, the undermining, the indifference towards women human rights defenders, and the shrinking space that they're trying to do their work in. And what's striking here in this particular category is the fact that across the consultations, it was revealed that governmental actors, people, they see WPS or Resolution 1325 as a quote unquote women's issue. So gender equality is very much missing still from this framework, which really undermines the implementation and what can be achieved. Accountability, the third one, this is where we have found that there is an increased lack of policy coherence and integrated approach. NAPs kind of very similar have become this check the box exercise without doing much for the lives of women and girls and marginalized populations. So overall, as I mentioned, that these are cross-cutting findings and or challenges. And what's happening here is that we see a great display of public effort by states to implement Resolution 1325. But underneath, sometimes in subtle, sometimes not so subtle ways, there is pushback and resistance to the holistic implementation. And there's a serious lack of forgetting what the intention of the Resolution 1325 was, which is basing it on human rights, gender equality, conflict prevention, root cause analysis, and of course, disarmament. So these were the overall challenges. I'm sure our panelists will explain further what they understand from them. And we'll, in the panel, we'll talk about recommendations as well. So thank you so much for listening, and to all the panelists here and everyone who has given their time to this project. It's been a wonderful experience for me. I hope you enjoy the report as much as I enjoyed doing the research. So please be on the lookout for it, and any questions, feel free to pose them through the Q&A function today. So thank you.
Thank you, Sanem. Could you share when the report will be available and where the audience will be able to read the final report?
So we're planning to have it ready in a couple of weeks, and it should be available through the Peace Women website. They can also reach the report through our Peace Women listserv. So if they'd like to be added to that, that's an option as well.
Great, and thank you so much for sharing how you and the team went about having these consultations in COVID times, but also, more importantly, being able to integrate that analysis and lived experience of women around the world on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And thank you to the donors also who've supported Peace Women and WILPF through our work on Women, Peace and Security, which include the Government of Switzerland and UN Women. I'm going to move now to our panel, and we're very excited to dig deeper into this report, the findings, and to hear your perspectives from where you are located and from the work you're doing. Before I start the panel, I received this morning the news that our dear sister Joy Oneso cannot join us today because many of you have seen the headlines. Last night there was a very sad attack on peaceful protesters in Lagos, and the peace movement and Joy are part of the crisis response to organize women in Nigeria and across Nigeria to call for an end to the violence by the military and the police, to call for accountability for those that have been attacked. And therefore, although we're so sad not to have Joy, we understand her full energy needs to be working with her networks in Nigeria. We're going to start with a short video of Joy, which she posted online and shared with us here in the WILPF Secretariat this morning. So you can hear directly from her about what it's like to wake up as a feminist peace activist in the year 1325 plus 20 and have to organize. Genevieve, can we play the short video, please, of Joy?
Yes, one moment, just getting it set up.
When we're waiting for the video, I'll just share one message that I received in writing from a group of women activists that Joy sent us, and they reiterated this message for the international community and for the government of Nigeria. Violence is never a response to a peaceful protest. Nigerian women are mourning their children and demanding that the government be held accountable. We ask that you stand with us in these trying times to demand your government to hold the Nigerian government accountable. And now we can hear from Joy, who is also the international president of the WILPF board and the director of WILPF Nigeria. She is a great peace activist, a visionary leader, and a protector of human rights. So let's try this video. Yes, okay. We cannot hear the sound, Genevieve.
One moment, Maria. It seems like we're having a bit of a technical issue. Should we move on to the panel and then I can figure out how to do it later?
Great. Yes, thank you, Genevieve, and thank you for problem solving in our world of Zoom. We'll come back to share the video of Joy when we can get it to work, and we'll also share the full link of the 8-minute video posted this morning. Diana, I have a great pleasure to turn to you next. The president of WILPF Colombia, a feminist, an anti-militarist, and you have extensive experience in working to protect women's rights in conflict, to organize, and to bring the voices of Colombian women to the global community. It's inspiring to work with you and to learn from you, and we're looking forward to touching on a few subjects with you today, particularly with the increased oppression by governments around the world. We've heard about Nigeria, particularly this morning. We've also seen the reality in Colombia. We'd like you to reflect on what this means for women activists and for nonviolent protesters around the world. How does this rising oppression affect your work in Colombia? And Diana will be speaking in Spanish, so please remember to use your translation function. Thank you.
Gracias. Buen día para todos.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. And I thank you the opportunity. The program also always open to be able to share the reality of our countries And I send a solidarity hug to our sister Joy. No, it's not an easy situation by any means. And in Colombia, the last few months, we have been lived days in which we have our heart shattered given the police brutality, the lack of response of a government that's right wing, that maintains a war logic and that promotes violent practices to repress the legitimate demands of the Colombian people. In this moment, we're in Colombia living through a moment of resistance that gives us a lot of strength, and it's the indigenous people, the Minga, hundreds or thousands of indigenous people who are united, walking the country from one side to another, arriving to Bogota to demand the Van Duque government that they sit with them who are the legitimate owners of these lands, the legitimate owners of the most important acts of resistance that have taken place. And I want to share this because we need collective strength and everywhere in the world to be able to resist these oppressive and unequal systems. And it's very inspiring for me to be here with you and to be able to listen to you. With the research and the proposals that we were doing for this space, I wanted to mention a few things based in this particular moment that we're living, and that's in Colombia after the signing of the peace agreements, even though the reality changed in the territories where the conflict was stronger. The next day of the after the peace agreements, the women were able to wake up peacefully in their pajamas and not thinking that they were having to leave their home in the middle of the night because of the bombings or the violence. And that simple thing of daily life has made a transformation in women's lives who have lived the conflict in a harder way. And it has shown us that signing peace was worth it. And of course, this peace agreement would not have been possible without all the moments, all the advocacy processes that the women did in our different diversities, indigenous, Afro, lesbian women, the women from the armed forces doing their own resistance in their own structures, which are also patriarchal, and we all achieve something that's a public good for the whole world, which is a peace agreement that has more 100 proposals that are specific gender proposals, specific for women. So that possibility for us, as us, WILPF and Colombia, would not have been possible if we had not seen an agenda for security that we fought for over 20 years, and that is a reflection of the insistence of women to build peace. So of course, this moment really moves us because it's true that there's some steps back, not only in Colombia, but many places in Latin America where the presidents of these countries, the president, government of Colombia is limiting the implementation, the peace agreements, which we build, women as well, and for which we are doing this whole process for implementation. In this process of implementation of the agreement, there's been more threats to the human rights defenders in an exponential way. And that's only one reflection of how the peace agreement implementation is not a reality yet. Even though we've had the peace agreement, the violence and the structural disequality is still a daily fact of life.
Thank you, Diana, for bringing us into the reality of the post-agreement Colombia and the work that's happening. And it really resonated, I think, and I saw Ines from Libya nodding when you said that signing the peace agreement was worth it to wake up in the morning. So thank you for giving us also that message of hope within the struggles you have. The second part I want to come to, and you touched on the post-agreement implementation. Could you go in a little deeper to one area that came out in the report, which is demilitarization? What have you learned? What have women activists learned in this period of disarmament, laying down of arms, and demilitarization at the local level, community to community in Colombia? What have you learned?
Bueno, los aprendizajes en este tiempo han
Well,
sido
the learnings have been amazing, especially to be able to achieve personally as a feminist and collectively like WILPF Colombia that understand that militarization is not only about our men at the streets, it's not only about the military men, the arms that come with the military, but it's also about understanding that the patriarchal system is based on a structure that promotes militarization, that promotes this ideology, this culture that's militaristic, that shows, for example, in very simple things like on October 31st, with like another country, it's, you know, kids get dressed up and the most popular dress up attires are police, military, anything that's associated with military forces. So the control that's exercised in the territories because they're military forces in the zone, but also when we have a president that only a few days ago, after police brutality, is dressed up as a policeman to reiterate that the supposed heroes of the country, so those that messaging that's being introduced in the daily life of Colombia show that militarization goes much beyond that, a lot beyond the budget that's given to the army, and that reflection that we have done collectively. There's several people from our team that have done this reflection, and that has been a reflection based on feminism and thinking about security from the anti-militaristic logic also makes us think that militarization or security has to be thought not only from human security, but it also has to be deconstructing that same concept of security that reinforces the structures of power that are militaristic in power. And so we have to understand not only that logic, but also to go and rethink the elements that in terms of racism, classist, machista, of course, sexist, that oppress women and which lead to violent and dependency relations. So thinking of security from that point of view, that has made it possible for us to look at militarism and anti-militarism in a different way. And of course, the idea of building new political objects, not only women, but also men who think seriously what it means to be a man and who are seeing women have a political action that has overcome all kinds of violences.
Thank you, Diana. We're going to stick with the issue around militarism and move to Gabriela Erston, who's the Policy and Advocacy Officer at WILPF Sweden. She formerly worked in Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of WILPF. Gabriela, could you continue on where Diana brought us to on the understanding of militarism as an interconnecting system, and maybe share how we can address militarism, disarmament, and demilitarization within the Women, Peace and Security agenda, within the implementation of Women, Peace and Security? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first, I think I think that the question on how we can do it is not actually the big question in this sense, because as WILPF and the rest of the women's community, we know how to. We do it every day. We challenge militarism. We talk about where investment should go. We talk about women's participation and so on. And what actually builds women's security is by participation and conflict prevention, and that builds security. So the how, I don't see as a real problem. Actually, we know the how. We know how to do it. The main problem, I think, is a political will. I mean, if you look at, I'm going to use Sweden as an example, since that is my expertise and where I work. If you look at Sweden, Sweden is in one way a big women, peace and security supporter, and one of the big financer of women's organizations around the world, and the women, peace and security. But that is one part of Sweden and the Swedish government, and this, the other part is the increasing militarization that happens in Sweden right now, and the political will to maybe always choose militarized security before human security. For example, Diana talked about Colombia. Sweden was very much pushing for the peace negotiations in Colombia, giving political support. But as soon as the peace agreement entered into force, just a couple of months after, Sweden entered an MOU, an agreement with Colombia on that, for a potential arms trade to Colombia, for example, for fighter jets, amongst other things. So this is really what shows the lack of political will from, and I think it's especially problematic when it comes to Sweden and other countries that are big supporters of women, peace and security, that they're not taking it all the way, that they're also investing in militarization, arms trade, and so on. So even the ones that are our biggest supporters and also biggest finance supporters in this area, they're not completely invested in this. The political will is always the militarized way of doing it. And I mean, Sweden is part of that. Sweden is investing heavily in arms and militarization right now. We have the biggest defense budget that we've had since the Cold War right now.
Thank you, Gabriela. Really important to hold up the mirror, as civil society should in all our contexts, to call for better actions and more transformative actions for peace. The second question, because you've worked a lot in disarmament, Gabriela, and understand a lot of the decision-making processes around disarmament at the global level, could you give some insights on how women, peace and security could be integrated into decision-making on disarmament better? What's your thinking?
Well, I mean, women, peace and security is and was originally thought as to challenge status quo, to challenge current structure, patriarchal structures, and in order for women, peace and security to be, I mean, the last couple of years, if we just look back 10 years, we went to UN meetings, disarmament meetings, and no one really talked about women, peace and security. Today, they are talking about women, peace and security, but they're cherry picking. They're taking out the women's participation, so adding women to already patriarchal militaristic structure, and not really addressing the problem from the ground. What really should, I mean, our answer is also, when it comes to disarmament, first of all, you have to have a political will to actually change, to actually demilitarize. But then also, in many countries, including Sweden, security policies, defense policies is still highly male-dominated, and a certain type of masculinity that is, so you really, as well as we talk about peace processes, should include all people from society, all acts of society. I think this is one of the key recommendations here too, to really open up the security field and the defense field to everyone in the society. So I think that's the main recommendation that we should take. And fortunately, it's not happening because the security and defense policies are very much hiding behind secrecy, that we can't share this, we can't do this because of our national security reasons. But I do think that they need to open up more and be more willing to change, of course.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. I'm going to move straight on to our next panelist, Dr. Ludmila Kiwiko, I hope I pronounced your family name, is a member of WILPF Australia Board and a researcher at the Gender Institute in Australia's National University. Thank you for joining us and staying up late in Australia to join us on the webinar. We've actually heard from Diana and Gabriela around the intersectionality of women, peace and security and the integrated approaches of women, peace and security. But what do you see as missing and most needed in moving forward the agenda in a progressive way, ensuring that intersectionality is really at the center of our work?
Thanks, Maria, and thank you, everybody. It's great to have an opportunity to be here with all of you to hear your insights and wonderful thoughts about both the celebrations of and acknowledgements of 1325, but also still the challenges, the many challenges. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work in Australia, on the Canberra's Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty of Indigenous lands have never been ceded in Australia. And I think that that's an important place on which to start and to open in terms of issues around intersectionality, particularly for a country like Australia, which still has many issues to deal with in terms of its Indigenous peoples, in terms of human rights issues, and also in terms of the way that we think about peace and act out peace and human security in our country. I wanted to also, as well as talking a little bit about intersectionality, talk about the integrated approaches that are missing from the WPS agenda as well. And I just focus on the Australian situation, which I know best, and just comment about some of our experiences here. Australia had its first NAP come into place in 2012, and it concluded in July 2019. And despite the development of almost 2 years of working on the second NAP and the anniversary that's coming up with 1325, right now there's no information about whether there's going to be a second Women, Peace and Security Plan and when that will be announced or not. So it's hard not to think that the silence right now in Australia also says something about the commitment to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And I think that that's an important context for us to be thinking about. There are two sort of sets of critical issues around what's been happening with respect to intersectional approach and gender equality, and also integration around integrated approaches in terms of the WPS agenda in Australia. One of them, the first relates to the fact that there's a giant gap between what's been an outward looking focus in Australia in terms of Australia's work on WPS overseas, rather than in terms of domestic policy and activities. In fact, there's quite a limited linkages between the domestic and the international focus on women, peace and security. And this is perhaps really disappointing in terms of building a domestic program that not only addresses inequality and promotes gender equality, but also looks at the, issues such as around domestic policies such as family and domestic violence, Indigenous rights, migration, refugees, human rights, trafficking, climate change, prevention of violent extremism, and this increasing securitization as well that many have already spoken about as well. So there's that distinct disconnect, and also then a homogeneity of how issues are approached in terms of women at large being a homogeneous group rather than a group that is considered in all its complexity with respect to intersectional issues. And we can come back and talk about that in a bit more detail, but I wanted to highlight the other issue, which I think is also critical and important, and I hear that already in the other panelists' comments, and that's a lack of policy integration and coherence, and a lack of practice in Australia in particular, but I hear it in others' voices as well, about not linking between domestic and international approaches to women, peace and security, but also these major structural inconsistencies in policy and women and peace implementation. And Gabriela, when I was listening to you, I was thinking very much of what's begun to happen in our country. So it's not just this inconsistency that's been emerging, including in a increasingly militarized posturing in Australia, but this contradiction at the same time of promoting a women, peace and security agenda. And let me just give one or two quick examples here. So in 2013, Australia was an extremely strong supporter of the Arms Trade Treaty, and we looked at reducing, in particular, gender-based violence in conflict settings, and supported the first ever Security Council resolution dedicated to addressing small arms and light weapons. This then was integrated into the foreign policy papers. But in 2018, at the same time as the first National Action Plan is concluding, the Australian government announces that it's going to have a defence export strategy. And it announces its intention to become one of the world's largest arms manufacturers and exporters over the next decade. So these policies and practices then sit in stark opposition to those proposed in the National Action Plan in relation to women, peace and security, conflict prevention, and support for things like the arms trade. In 2017,
Ludmila, I'm wondering if, thank you so much, and I think you've really amplified and echoed the issue around the limitations of national action plans as well that we've seen. Could I ask you a question around opportunities? So maybe potential opportunities in the short term or long term, but where you see various actors in your context where you're working that could improve. What do you see as one or two opportunities you could share?
Sure. Curiously, I think one of the interesting opportunities is going to be trying to address some of these kinds of increasing militarization and normalization of militarization issues. So as we see a response to COVID, in particularly, interestingly, in Australia, we've also seen an acceleration of this movement towards militarization in terms of increasing budgets for the military, increasing acceptance of militarization in responses to domestic crises as well. And curiously, I think this also presents an opportunity for interventions in terms of many different women's groups and peace activist groups in Australia galvanizing around a response to meet the to promote peace and conflict prevention, particularly by adopting a rights-based human security approach to peace and security policy and practice. And already we've begun to see, just in the last few weeks, it's a critical time in our country with respect to economic responses to COVID and the situation that we've seen here in terms of recession and increased job declines, where many groups who have perhaps in the past not been aligned around peace and conflict issues are actually coming together in terms of thinking about what this means politically, what this means in terms of economic restructuring, what it means to have the political decision-making made that emphasizes, instead of human security, social responses, responses to Australia's future being defined in terms of increasing manufacturing in the defence area. So in a strange way, it's a kind of a contradiction. And I think echoes perhaps some of the other issues that Gabriela raised in relation to Sweden.
Thank you. And I think also giving us this insight of how social movements need to come together. It's essential that we work across issues, across movements, across organizations at this time as human rights, the environment are under threat globally. Thank you for that reminder and the opportunities. I'm going to move to our final speaker today. And just to mention before I do, I've seen some comments and some suggestions shared already, but if you could formulate any questions, you can use the Q&A function in the bottom panel of Zoom, and you can ask a question to any panelists or to all. And after we've heard Ines, I'll be able to take those questions. So if you could help me and just write it in question format and leave out any memories or other comments for now, that would be really good as we multitask in Zoom. Ines, it's a great pleasure we get to hear and speak with you today. You're the co-founder and director of a very important organization in Libya, the Tamazight Women's Movement. You're also the co-coordinator of the 1325 network in Libya. We've had the pleasure to partner with you and learn from you over many years, and we're looking forward to hearing your perspective. Building on what we've heard already from different contexts, could you reflect more on the importance of intersectionality within your work, within women, peace and security in Libya? Also how you've seen the rising attacks on human rights defenders. What, in your opinion, can we do as a movement to ensure that women have safe and meaningful participation in the women, peace and security agenda? Thank you, Ines.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to hear all the panelists speaking about the different issues of women, peace and security, particularly Diana. I think many of the things that have been shared have resonated a lot, particularly in the context of Libya. And I think to answer your part of the question, intersectionality, since 2015, together with colleagues, we co-founded the Tamazight Women Movement. And in our ways, the movement or the collective was meant to engage with women, peace and security agenda from an intersectional perspective, and to bring that to the current conversation that women's movement and different movements, the youth movement in Libya is holding, what it really means to have an intersectional feminist peace process. Because I do think feminist peace process, at least for me as someone coming from global South, is essentially recognizing the intersection realities of the different insecurities on the ground in conflict and post-conflict areas, but also in places of peace. And how can we challenge not only intersectionality in a sense of making sure that indigenous women, particularly as I come from an indigenous community, that are participating meaningfully, but also women, rural women, and women in IDP women, to be involved in the peace process, but also to share, to think how the system is intersectional in its systematic doing of injustice, you know, and I think to question that and to pose that question, not only to the government of Libya, but also to the UNSCR, which is the United Nations mission in Libya, and how are they approaching the peace process from intersectional perspective, either as I said, bringing out the issue, the systematic issues in our context, but also how are the indigenous and minorities are participating effectively and meaningfully. Even though we still have now, it's almost 9 years since the conflict in Libya. You know, it's such a lifetime. I didn't think I would last to be a human rights defender. It's very sad that I'm not so much bringing the stories of hope, you know. And in 9 initiative that is led by the UNSCR, women are really rarely included. So bringing actually the issue of indigenous women is not only in the agenda at all. You know, like we just right now, we are just in a phase to think about how actually women are participating in the peace process. So it's still a question of integrating what we call the basics elements of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda framework. And I think not only we think about it from, this is what I say, why intersectional approach is important, but also thinking about how discrimination and inequality has been a huge element perpetuated not only by the government to exclude women, but also to justify that women, peace and security as not a priority, is not a priority for Libya. And I think one of the balance talk about, like when we talk about women, peace and security agenda, how they are picky, cherry picking, which is so true, because for them it's only about participation, and even though it's not fulfilled, but women, peace and security is more than participation. It's about also thinking about demilitarization, about disarmament. It's also about gender-based violence, which is something considered a taboo to speak about in Libya. And going back to the human rights defender issue, and I think that's one of the things that I see after 20 years in the 1325 resolution, that we should take, as you said, like I think Sanam, she said, like we see the increased attack and pushback of the human rights defenders and the excluding them from the space. We see this in Libya. It's not only started to be as a symptom, but definitely a leading cause for the violence happening against a human rights defender. I think the protection of human rights defenders, and I think what we do, for me, I always think about this, what we do to ensure the minimum kind of protection measures for human rights defenders. But first one, that should not compromise their participation. Because for some reason, when we speak about protection, for some reason that means that ensuring that they're not visible anymore. You know, that's the immediate reaction. But it's actually about ensuring measures, meaningful measures for women from the first place, is to think about the root causes, why human rights defenders are actually being attacked. To tackle these root causes of attacking, particularly women and human rights defenders who are working in and engaging in the peace and security agenda.
Thank you, Ina, so much for really making this clear point about addressing the context, the root causes of exclusion and of violence. Would you like to speak a little bit to the peace table, or these multiple peace tables we hear about, and we hear about recently on Libya and in other conflicts of the region and of course globally? We have, the agenda has focused a lot on participation in track 1 processes. What's your analysis of where we are with inclusion of women at these peace tables, and where do you see the focus for the women's movement, civil society going forward in regards to influencing track 1 processes? Is it worth our time and effort?
I think we have gone so little when it comes to actually including women in the peace table in Libya. I think you said it. There's so many right now in Libya. There's one key word that I wanted to resonate with everyone: lack of transparency. And lack of transparency and the lack of information towards a process that is supposedly to be owned by Libyans and particularly by Libyan women. I think that right now there's almost like, I don't know, like there's 3 tracks particularly, and there's a new youth track, and there's the Berlin also process, and all these different trajectories of what we call the peace process have left an important, very significant actor, which is women. And I'm not saying that women are in informal spaces are keep pushing, because sometimes this has been interpreted as if women, they're not there, they don't want to be there. No, women are deliberately excluded in these processes happening, either mediation processes, just like maybe 2 months ago, 2 mediation initiatives from civil society supported by UNSCR in Geneva and Morocco. Non-single women has been participating, only Stephanie actually, which is the head of the envoy, the current envoy for UNSCR. I think we are really unfortunately, as I said, I don't have hope stories in terms of progress, but in terms of our efforts, we do see as women's movement, and this is something we have a constant conversation around, what does really matter. We think about participation as a key issues, but also about restructuring, a conversation about restructuring the peace table. We don't want to be invited in a predetermined agenda, in a predetermined settings. We really want to be substantively and meaningfully be designers of this table. I think it might seem radical in the context of Libya to say that, but this is actually when I hear Diana speaking about the peace process in Colombia, and this is a very completely different practice from the international community in Libya. I think to ensure that once the peace agreement is signed and that my regular, really daily, as you said, daily, really basic daily needs from a very simple human security definition should be addressed, that is definitely will happen if actually women who are, as I said, even though treated as a minority majority of the population, to ensure a really successful peace process in Libya.
Great. Thank you, Ines. We have so many great questions. I'm going to move straight to them from the participants in the webinar today, and thank you for sharing them. The first, I'm going to group these 2 questions, comes from Shushma in India, and also an anonymous question. It's on the pandemic. How is the pandemic impacting your work, and how can we look into the economic status of women in COVID-19 times who are losing their jobs and economic status? Diana, would you like to share with us how the COVID pandemic and restrictions are impacting peace work in Colombia, and particularly around the economic and livelihoods? Thank you. If you could keep it to 2 minutes, then we can have more.
Sí. Okay. Bueno, primero quisiera dar
So first of all, I want to share important statistic. $27,809 are being invested right now on a daily basis in the war in Colombia. This was a budget approved just yesterday in the Congress of the Republic, and that shows the impact of the pandemic versus the rights for health and education, which every day are lessened. How has it affected us? Well, us in particular, all the challenges that we have in working with women in very rural areas in a country that doesn't have good connectivity. So we begin with the problems there, but I would like to focus on in 2 issues in particular. One, the increase of violence against women within families has increased, and that happens due to many factors because of that lack of control, which the home it continues to be the most dangerous place for women. And on the other hand, economic autonomy in Colombia, the unemployment has increased, but unemployment for women has increased and exponentially, not only because they don't have quality jobs, but also because of precarious jobs that we had before are once again being taken away from women. So the precariousness, even precarious jobs are very limited. And of course, there's a moment that one of the colleagues was talking about before, and which is militarization and control in the territories. That's permanent in Colombia. The response to the pandemic is a military response, which comes from domination of arms and from the military, and that has affected, not only has that increased the rejection of human rights offenders, but there has also been the feminist agenda and the rights of women has been taken advantage by the government that is really going against the peace agreement and which is going back in many of the rights that women have gained. For example, not talking about intersectionality in the government, limiting the conversation about sexual and reproductive rights, and promoting the economic autonomy based on the rules that women have adopted in society. Sorry, that was very fast. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We have received a number of questions. I'm going to turn to Gabriela next, from Anne-Marie, from Tamara, from Jennifer. I'm going to group them. The first one, Gabriela, is about experience in analyzing the impacts of national arms trade in a specific country, buying weapons from Sweden or Switzerland or Canada or Australia. So importing countries. Have you methodologies for looking at the impacts in importing countries that you could share with Anne-Marie? There's a group of questions, a number of questions on NATO. How has WILPF or any of the panelists considered the adverse impacts of NATO on the women, peace and security agenda? And further comments on that. And in similar, Jennifer's question was on how can disarmament be central to WPS, but I think you have touched on that. Gabriela, could you start us on those questions?
Yes, so I'm guessing how, but at WILPF Sweden, we don't do a lot of research, so we haven't done exactly what I think the question is asking, but what we do is that because of this, the two-faced Sweden, what we do is that since Sweden has a feminist foreign policy and is a big supporter of the women's peace and security agenda, what we do is that we use Sweden's own argument and Sweden's own research and facts. Sweden, for example, does every year report on every country in the world and the status of human rights and democracy and so on. So we use those kind of information gathering, and of course also with our WILPF sisters, information from how they experience their country's setting and so on. And we use that in our policy and advocacy work towards the Swedish government. So I'm not sure if that answers the questions completely, but that's how we work a lot. And then the question of NATO. Sweden is not a part of NATO, so I don't have a lot of specific information about NATO. But in general, Sweden is of course what do you call it? A friend of NATO. So Sweden is, for example, taking on the role of 1325 expert within NATO settings and so on. But like I said before, they are mostly focusing on participation and pretty much making war safe for women instead of actually preventing war. Yeah, I think this third question, I can't remember.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to add in to Gabriela's response? And I know that several of the WILPF sections in Europe, WILPF Germany and others are working on No to NATO campaign and analysing also the impacts in this regard. I'm going to continue, and we have some great questions. One short question I want everyone to answer, but in the shortest words you can. What is the new frontier, so to speak, Ellie wrote, of the women peace movement in 2021 or 2022? So if you can just say in 1 or 2 words what you think the new frontier of our collective work is. Ines, would you like to start us off? The new frontier, so to speak.
I would say demilitarization.
Great, thank you. Okay, quick fire round, or quick round we can say. Ludmila, what do you think is the new frontier? 1 word, or please unmute.
I would say new allies in terms of demilitarization, climate, and women, peace and security. So I think an expansion of allies in terms of looking at demilitarization.
Thank you. Diana.
Todo lo demás y la ultraderecha y los
Let's
gobiernos.
say the far right and ultra-conservative governments.
Thank you. Gabriela.
I would say inclusion. So try to, in our own movements, to really include more people from different kinds of way of lives and groups.
Thank you. Thank you all for answering Ellie's question. The next question is from Eleanor O'Gorman, a WILPF International member, and she's asking us a challenging question today. Should we put in the bin 1325 and start with a more explicit feminist base, organizing outside the UN and states? Should we dismantle the funding mechanisms that drive the current poor implementation? Or can we make both these genuinely transformative and explicitly, unapologetically feminist? Diana.
Sí, creo que echar a la basura la 1325.
Yeah, I think we have to toss away 1325. It would be to toss away more than 20 years of women's stories that have been struggling for peace in many places and have laid their life on the line for the feminist agendas to be able to arrive to the United Nations, which is also a patriarchal space that make that institutionality do this what it does have to do and transform our activity.
Brilliant. The floor is open for anyone else to come in on this important question. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely do not want to scrap the women, peace and security agenda. I mean, as we have talked about, it's the implementation that is lacking. There's nothing wrong with the written word or the thought behind it. And I could just give Sweden established a so-called feminist foreign policy in 2016. And I mean, that one, even though it's new and it talks a lot about feminist analysis and power structure and patriarchy, even that has similar problems to the women, peace and security agenda. And that's not because it's newer or has more updated language and things like that. It's because the ones that are supposed to implement it are not implementing it correctly. So I definitely don't think, and like Diana said, it would be scrapping our work that we've done for a long time. But I do think we should challenge ourselves and try new ways to come up with new ways.
And I have another comment from Nina, who has said she has proposed in an article that the Secretary General launch a time-bound, 3-pronged initiative. And this includes appointing an independent expert to lead on the formulation of a plan for implementation of the outstanding women, peace and security resolutions. It continues. So what do you think of this expert independent advisory group as a mechanism to move forward implementation? What do you think of this idea? Any comments, Ludmila?
I think we had an excellent expert advisory panel in 2015, which came up with some absolutely brilliant ideas, which every time I look at the things that that we say and the critiques of the WPS agenda, they're still there. And I've heard so many people over the last couple of years say it's about implementation. It's about stopping talking about and going round and round in circles about this. It's actually, oh, there's a pussycat. It's about implementation in reality. And I would also add quite strongly, it's also about accountability. That is something that one thing in our experience in Australia, after 6 or 7 years of the first National Action Plan, we don't still know what it is that in fact was effective or worked or can be learned from or can be moved forward. So I think we also need to find some concrete ways to move that implementation around accountability. Accountability in terms of the engagement, not just on gender equality and security issues, but rethinking how we address that challenge to ourselves as well as to the implementers, our governments and our partners as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, Ines.
While Ludmila speaking, I was just thinking about accountability for sure, because it's not an issue of mechanisms. I think it's an issue of implementation and a disconnection between headquarters and actually areas of conflict, and I think on the ground and what it means to reality for people's lives, you know, because I feel that there's no really human face right now when we discussing conflict from a policy level. I also think about when we're talking about dismantling the system, I think about decolonization approach to the system. I think that is maybe something we should think about, and how we can reclaim it again. How can we reclaim also autonomous resources, you know, or resourcing to our feminist and peace feminist movements, of course, while we are facing these, this machinery. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to take one final question. We've received so many, and I'm really thank you to all the participants for writing the questions, and maybe there's a way Peace Women team can also get back to some specifically on Peace Women and WILPF. There's a question on how can we make men more feminist? Are there any countries where examples are in place where men could increase their engagement in feminist action? Diana, could you take this one? I know you're working on this area of work in Colombia.
Sí, gracias. Es una pregunta difícil.
Thank you. It's a difficult question for us because, and my cat here also, by the way, is feminist. And we've been working with men to generate alliances in the feminist agenda. We don't have still clear, okay, personally, I don't have a posture that men can be feminists. Men can be allies of feminists. They can be allies in the feminist agenda. And in this sense, we can walk together in the construction of peace and democracy and for full life for all people. But until this world is not different, and when this world doesn't mean if you're born a man or woman, give you pre-established privileges, then when men don't have a higher equality than women in Nigeria, Colombia, and Libya, and all places, then men can be feminist. But in the meantime, we will speak that men are born with privileges and they can be allies in the feminist struggle and movement.
Thank you, Diana. And WILPF is also working with the Men Engage Alliance on a 4-country project, including Colombia, Afghanistan, Cameroon, and Democratic Republic of Congo. And we'll be participating and bringing the idea of combating militarized masculinities to the upcoming Umbuto Symposium of the Men Engage Alliance in early November. So this will be a conversation to be able to get deeper into feminism and militarism as it relates to also engaging men and boys in our work. I'm going to close the panel and hopefully we can try and hear this short video from our sister Joy, because it's an important message and Genevieve and I are persistent in our challenge with technology. So Genevieve, let's try once more to hear Joy Oneso, the international president of WILPF, the president of WILPF Nigeria, share with us what's happening there this morning.
Was it still not working?
No, it's not working. Is it the headphones or no?
It says that my Zoom needs to re-update. Sorry about that, everyone. We will pop the link into the chat maybe, and then everyone can watch it. It was on Facebook Live. So would that work, Maria?
Yes, that works, Genevieve. And I think collectively, as Diana and our other panelists have said today, we send our solidarity to the peace movement in Nigeria, as we do to those struggling in all conflicts and situations around the world. And we bring back that word cloud we did, which were all the strengths of the women in our lives, resilience and kindness and vision, and women from the global south, to our daily work. I really want to thank our speakers, the panelists, and Sanam for presenting the findings of the report on behalf of WILPF, and of course the Peace Women program team, Zarin, Genevieve, and all the others who contributed behind the scenes to making the webinar possible. You can download the report on the WILPF website and on Peace Women website in the next few weeks, and we'll send it to everyone who subscribed to the webinar today. We have heard loud and clear from women activists that we can no longer let powerful states define what security is. We have learned from you all, the women peace activists, that conflict is driven by exclusion, that it impacts our daily lives, our human rights, our way of waking up in the morning. And the violations of human rights should be the early warning that armed violence is never the solution. As Joy had reminded us today, there must be an alternative to violence. There must be dialogue and a way forward to guarantee human rights for all, and to really bring to life the transformative goals of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, of this feminist peace agenda, and that feminist peace is peace for all, and that it addresses the root causes of violence, as Ines and all our panelists underlined. And that each of you underlined today, there must be follow-up action at the local, at the community level, at the regional level, and indeed at the global level. We thank you all for participating in the webinar today, and we look forward to joining you in the next conversations. We have 2 webinars in the next week coming up, actually. One is on the Middle East, North Africa region, and there was some specific questions about Yemen and Syria in the chat today, and I think they'll be most appropriate for our webinar next week on COVID-19 and gender justice. And we have a discussion on peace in Korea, looking at the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the Korean conflict. And we hope that those that are working on those issues are also willing to learn from women from the Middle East and the Korean region to join in those discussions. Thank you all on behalf of WILPF. Bye-bye.